So it's really great to be in Florida. This is my third trip down to Florida to talk about Common Core, and it's one of the states I love because I think you guys have a real opportunity to get rid of this. Not only have you had it longer, so you've seen its detrimental effects better, but you're culturally, Florida is one of those states that shouldn't have this. We've seen South Carolina pull out, we've seen Oklahoma pull out, Texas never took it. This is culturally right in your wheelhouse. If you could, as some of your first speakers said, if you can get to the point where you can convince, particularly your Republican politicians, that the money just isn't worth it, it comes with too many ties and strings, then you're going to be in a really good position, I think, to fight this off. And it's all about knowledge, as your candidates are telling you, that if the more people who just know what this is, the better able you are going to be to beat it back. And so, as you sit here today, let me ask a question. I always like to begin my talks by asking this. I assume, because you're here today on a beautiful Saturday morning, that most of you are more informed than most of the people in your state about Common Core. But even having said that, would you raise your hand if you are still a little confused about what Common Core is, where it comes from, who's behind it? Let me see just a quick show of hands. All right, and so this is as I expected. It's about a third of you who would say that you are, and that shows that you are a more educated audience. But it never hurts, I think, to go and look at the complicated nature of what Common Core is. So the talk that I give, it's an introduction to what it is, it's an explanation of how it functions, and ultimately it touches on what are some of the core dangers that nobody in the establishment who supports it wants to talk about. And that's a problem, too. How many of you have, given that we have a lot of activists here, how many of you have heard the same cliches? This is a set of standards, it's not curriculum. We have state and local control in this state, right? How many of you have heard these talking points, that curriculum are not standards? It's just absurd. And so I'd like to go ahead and try to dispel some of that stuff today. So briefly, what is Common Core? Just so we're all on the same page, Common Core is an abbreviated term. It's used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards in English and math with science and history and social studies all forthcoming, written and copyrighted by the NGA and the CCSSO. Before we even get out of that first sentence, before we even get through that first sentence, I'd like to underscore how duplicitous Common Core is and how it presents itself. We know that nobody anywhere has had a vote on Common Core. That your legislators didn't get to vote on whether to accept it or not, the governors did not, the Senate and the Congress never had any hearings about Common Core. In a very carefully scripted way, the Department of Education pretended to play no part in this. Moms and dads, teachers unions had no say in this. Why in the world do they call them the state standards? It's probably for the same reason they call Obamacare the Affordable Care Act. And sadly, how many of our American fellow citizens, when they hear the word affordable, well, we like affordability, right? You remember these word games Common Core is a hugely bipartisan problem. And in my 33 states, this is my 229th talk in 15 months in 33 states. And in all those states, I have to tell you honestly, the Republicans have been the harder sell than the Democrats. The Democrats just want it. They don't care, they want it, they're unabashedly for it. But trying to convince our Republicans, who intrinsically really ought to know better, it's befuddled by, as your previous speaker said, it's befuddled by money. Right? There's so much money that the state is at least temporarily providing to support this stuff. Well, that makes sense, right? Whenever the federal government wants to do something at a grand scale, take something over, they'll flood your states with money until it's dug deep enough that you can't get rid of it, then the money goes away. It has been conservatively estimated that in about 5 or 6 years, states are going to be on the hook for all that money the feds are now dumping in. They're not going to keep doing it. Once it's in your state to the point that it's almost impossible to pull out, and it's in the country to the point that it's difficult, almost impossible to remove, then the federal government withdraws, and your states, all the states, become responsible for this. It's going to be billions and billions of dollars the states are going to have. Rather than collecting hundreds of millions from the federal government, you're going to be paying it in a short time. But they call it the Common Core State Standards for no reason. There is not any evidence, no shred of evidence whatsoever that the states had anything to do with this. In fact, the teachers in the states, the very small number of teachers in the states that actually got to see the standards, didn't even see them until after they were drafted, paid for, developed, revised, verified, and inserted in most states in the union through Race to the Top. Even when your Florida teachers got to see the standards in any meaningful way, they could not revise them, they could not reject them, they could not change them. In what sense is this state-led? Another myth we're going to debunk here is the myth that the governors had something to do with this. You've heard that one too, haven't you? It's a governor's initiative. Well, unfortunately, you've got Mr. Jeb Bush pushing this nonsense. And where do they get the idea that this is a governor's initiative? Because the two groups that are ultimately responsible for the Common Core, the NGA the National Governors Association and the CCSSO. These two groups, which are basically nothing more than lobbying groups. The NGA has been described by one of its former sitting governors as a meet and greet place for politicians to be, and their aides to be put in contact with lobbyists. These are not educational organizations, but you hear the word National Governors Association, and it's tempting to say, well, that would be great, right? If 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. But the problem with that, and I would prefer that to what we have, because if you had 50 state governors get in a room and bang out education standards, then you could unelect the governors if you didn't like what they did. The people who did this, the Common Core people, are utterly unaccountable. They've never been elected to you and me. They're not people we can get our hands on. And with all due respect, I live in Wisconsin. I have arguably the most conservative governor in the country, and he has been fantastic. But he's also been a terrible disappointment on this issue. Politically, he doesn't want to touch it. And I understand Mr. Walker's problem. You remember about 2 years ago, he took on the teachers union in Wisconsin and won and got recalled. And about $250 million of teacher union money then came in from the national unions to try to beat him. He won the recall against them. I understand. So I understand why he's a little hesitant to poke that bear again in an election year. But we need, without his strong leadership, it's not going anywhere in Wisconsin. And so far, after a year and a half of trying to urge and educate, he still is on the fence about what he wants to do. And this is part of the problem. But the NGA, so 50 state governors did do it. So I guess my point in bringing up the governor, Governor Walker, is what qualifications, for as much as I love him, what qualifications does Governor Walker have to write education standards? What qualifications does your governor have to do it? There's not a state in the union that has a governor who could do it. It requires a tremendous amount of sophistication and really a lot of educational experience to be able to craft a standard, particularly in things like math and science, for 60 million American school kids. As one professor, the only professor who was involved on the validation committee of Common Core, and who voted no, by the way, as he points out, there are only 22 mathematicians in this whole country who can do it. Not one of them was consulted in putting the standards together. So if the governors had done it, then we at least could get rid of them. So what is the NGA then? I'll give you one more example that the governors had nothing to do with this. There are a couple of governors who really supported strongly, like Jeb Bush and then Mike Huckabee in Arkansas, but they weren't involved in the writing of the standards. They weren't involved in crafting them or creating them or overseeing them. They're just cheerleading for them. Give you an example. Does anybody know who the sitting chair of the NGA is right now? Who is the sitting chair of the National Governors Association?
Who cares?
That would be Governor Mary Fallin of Oklahoma. And as you know, 2 months ago, the governor of the state of Oklahoma, the chair of the NGA, she went and pulled the state completely out of Common Core. Now think about that for a second. Right? When they tell you this is state-led, ask them for the evidence for this. Every piece of information I'll show you today is documented. And by the way, you can have all these slides. When we're done, we'll quickly throw up a website, or you can see me, I'll give you a card. You can have all this information for free. Because it's all documented. And all you get from the supporters of Common Core are talking points, right? How many of you have received the little one-page fact myth sheet, right? Myth, Common Core is federal. Fact, it's state-led. Isn't that awesome? No footnotes, no documentation. And when you ask the teachers or the superintendents or the politicians who hand you that, do they ever tell you how they know that? They don't. So you got these two basic lobbying groups. And I know some of you are taking notes, and one of the names I'd like you to think about or write down, so if you're doing further homework, is Joy Pullman, P-U-L-L-M-A-N. And Joy has written a definitive article. She works with the Heartland Institute. And she has written a definitive article on who actually wrote Common Core, and it can be traced back to 5 people. Chief among them, David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. The New York Times calls David Coleman the most important educator and educational administrator you have never heard of. Coleman has never been elected to any public office. He has never, ever been a classroom teacher. He's never taught. By the way, you know your Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has never been a classroom teacher, right? You know, why in the world would the President of the United States appoint a top educational executive in this country who's never been a classroom teacher? In fact, do you know what Arne Duncan's primary qualifications at school were? He is a sociologist. And you'll see, I know you know this, that Common Core is not an education. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about education, it's about sociological engineering. And so you got a sociologist in the Department of Education. Do you know what David Coleman's chief recommendation for being the architect of Common Core? And that's what he is. Coleman is the man who oversaw and wrote much of what we now know as Common Core. He is the lead person on this. Do you know what his major qualification was? He was Arne Duncan's roommate in college. That's how he got the job. And even if you think you like the standards, even if you think you do, I doubt we have many of those people here, but even if you think you do, ask yourself this. How in the world does the man who wrote the standards overwhelmingly oversaw them? How does he immediately leave Common Core once they're written and become the CEO of the college boards, where within months of finishing his work with Common Core, he is transforming the college boards, the ACT, to conform to his plan? How does that happen? How does it unelected happen? Not only is David Coleman now, the architect of Common Core, is transforming the test that every single American kid, whether they're Common Core educated or not, within 2 years of the creation, right? Within 2 years, all of these tests that kids have to take to get into college will be Common Core aligned. Do you see that that's a kind of high-level extortion? Not only is David Coleman rewriting the college boards, he's also now rewriting all the AP tests, all the tests your kids in high school take to get college credit. Have you heard about the new history standards, the new AP history standards? Here's something I would really urge you to do. I just haven't had time. It's so new, I haven't had time to add it to the presentation. Type the letters APUSH into your Google, A-P-U-S-H. APUSH will call up the complete new revision, and we've got it right here, the complete new revision of American history. Your kids are going to be learning now, mandated, if they want any college credit for history, they're going to have to regurgitate things on tests like the Founding Fathers were terrorists, like capitalism is the root cause of all the world's suffering, that America is not a free country, it is a land of imperialism and tyranny and colonialism and racism and sexism. This is now enshrined by the same man who rewriting the ACTs and the SATs, the architect of the Common Core. This is banana republic stuff. These people can't be touched. Here, this will blow you away. This is the actual copyright for Common Core. And it's not held by the Department of Education or the federal government or teachers unions or governors or states or moms and dads. It's held by 2 Washington lobbyist groups. How in the world does the transformational educational paradigm that's completely rewriting our schools, how is it owned not by anybody you and I can reach by the ballot box? How did that happen? This is banana republic stuff. This is what happens in third world tin horn dictatorships. And so you ask yourself, you're starting to sound a little conspiratorial out there, Pesta. Which maybe for this audience, you get that. But ask yourself the question, well, if the federal government wanted to take over education, why didn't they just do it? Why is there this copyright? Well, because of a 1965 federal statute, a couple of statutes, by the way. The federal government is prohibited. They cannot legally create national standards or a national curriculum. It's illegal. There was no such impediment with healthcare. And so they did the next best thing. The 5 individuals who wrote these standards have deep ties to the president, deep ties, as we see, to the Department of Education. Who paid for all of this? That would be Bill and Melinda Gates initially. Also huge donors, huge lobbyists, money bundlers, ideological co-travelers with the president and his administration. Bill Gates initially, back in 2008 and 9, put up $150 million of his own dollars to pay these 5 individuals with some help to write the standards. As you sit here today, Gates has spent over $4 billion on Common Core, almost all of it going to promote and propagandize for it. And because the Gates Foundation is a public trust with regards to its charitable donations, you can type in online, Bill Gates Common Core spending, and you will see a flow chart where every penny of that $4 billion has gone. And it is shocking. The only educational organizations in this country, the only ones that support Common Core, are the ones he paid. And he's paid hundreds of them. Do you know that way back in 2009, before the standards were even written, Gates had written multiple million-dollar checks to the National Parent-Teachers Association. And they were advertising and lobbying for Common Core before they had ever seen the standards. Why did 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core without being asked to? Well, the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the chief watchdog of Catholic schools in our country, was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars from Gates to promote these things. There's only one, as far as I can tell, there's only one serious so-called conservative organization that supports them. That's the Fordham Institute. And because it's the only conservative group that really supports it, they're everywhere. And Fordham is supposed to be a conservative think tank. And the irony is that they never tell you when they come and give their talks, Fordham, that they've received about $6 million from Gates in the last 4 years. You can't find anybody who supports Common Core that was not paid handsomely to do so.